So there are those simple little phrases that sometimes just are so very clear. I knew a guy who used to say all the time, "It is what it is." You know, that just says it. It is what it is. Or I'm a big movie fan, and so I love quotes from movies. The Godfather has that classic, "He made him an offer he couldn't refuse." so clear what the movie is all about. And of course, we have some of those phrases in Scripture that just in a few words say something so very clearly. And we hear one of them in James. James, the early church leader, James, very likely a brother of Jesus, in just a few words makes how we live out our faith or not so very clear. So by faith itself, James says, if it has no works, is dead. Well, that puts a pretty fine point on it, doesn't it? So faith by itself, if it has no works, is dead. We all know how important it is to be consistent with our faith, to live our faith out in real and practical ways. The more modern phrase you hear sometimes, if you're going to talk the talk, you gotta walk the walk. You know, our actions need to be consistent with our words. And we all, when we notice that not taking place, are a little bit frustrated or appalled at times. I think about a wedding that I had years ago, unbeknownst to me. One of the wedding, the groom, when he stood up and made promises of faithfulness, he had a girlfriend on the side on his wedding day. And he stood before his family, his friends, before God, before his bride, and made promises of faithfulness when he had a girlfriend on the side. We look at that and we go, oh, that's so clearly a sham, so wrong, that his words and his actions weren't consistent. We see that sometimes. I illustrated that with the kids' sermon, and right away people were aware of that in the congregation. The kids were aware that my words and my actions weren't consistent. In one of the churches that I served, there was a pastor who people were divided about, and it turns out the problem was that this pastor preached very good sermons on Sunday, and the people that knew the pastor just on Sunday liked him. But if you interacted with the pastor during the week, if you saw him in the office, if you heard his language, you saw the way that he lived, you knew that it wasn't consistent, and the congregation was kind of divided. People only knew him on Sunday, the words were good, but if they knew him during the week, not so much. Our words and our actions need to be consistent. And James reminds us of that very well, that faith without works is dead. I wanted to help us think about this a little bit more deeply this morning, to give us some practical ideas and some ways to think about what James is describing. So I have 5 different ways that we can make sure that we're living out our faith in the way that James describes. So the first thing is to remember that God is always watching us. God is always aware of what we do. I'll tell you, when I thought about this, and it kind of dawned on me that we could have this deeper awareness, I was out on the freeway driving along, and I had this experience of everybody around me starting to slow down. You've probably all had this when you're out driving. Everybody starts to slow down. What do? You look around. Okay, where's the policeman, right? You know, somebody had noticed the policeman, and everybody they saw the policeman, noticed they were being watched, looked at their speedometer. Oh, let's bring it down. Let's make sure we're doing the proper speed. And I remember thinking, God's always watching. God's always aware of what we're doing. God knows when we take those opportunities to live out our faith in practical and real ways, or when we don't. When we miss those opportunities, when we act without kindness or generosity or love, God's aware of this. What if we kind of always had this awareness that God's watching? Wouldn't that help our behavior to be more consistent with the way we want to live out our faith? Or if you prefer, maybe think about that in terms of Jesus. Most of us have been touched by, have heard that little poem about footprints. That's the poem where the man views his life, person views their life with Jesus walking alongside of them in the footprints, and then at the most difficult times, there's only one set of footprints, and that's because Jesus was carrying us in those hard times. We're comforted by that sense that Jesus is with us, but what if we remembered that Jesus is always walking beside us in our best moments and in our worst moments? Wouldn't that help us to live out our faith in concrete and real ways? So first, remember, God is watching. Jesus is with us, is watching. Second, others are watching as well. However we live out our faith in real and practical ways, or we don't, there's others around us who are watching. I remember thinking about this some years ago in one of my churches. There was a really unique and just a really great kid who was a part of the children and the youth program. And on one occasion, she was scheduled to go on a mission trip. We were going to Mexico to serve those in need. She was also part of a gymnastics program, and they were having a meeting during the summer, and the coach was talking about, it wasn't even like a real meet, I think it was a preliminary meet that was coming up, and this girl shared that she wouldn't be able to attend the meet. She would be going on a mission trip to Mexico. And the coach publicly berated this girl for not being dedicated to the team and being away on this mission trip. But she stood her ground. This young girl did. She said to her mom, you know, I think in a couple of years, I won't regret missing the gymnastics meet, but I will regret not being on that trip. And she went. She was such a great kid on that trip. And I remember thinking around that time, that girl's watching my faith. I wasn't contemplating anything bad at the time, but I just remember thinking that as a pastor and as a Christian, she was witnessing how I was living. And if I would do something wrong, that would affect this wonderful faith that I saw growing in this girl. All of us are being watched by young people, by others. Maybe if you're encouraging somebody in their faith journey, you're inviting them to church or praying for them, but then how you live or don't live out your faith, that's going to affect the witness you're trying to make to them. So God is watching, and others are watching and paying attention as well. Or the third thing is be aware as well as how you think about other people. Your perceptions of others and how you treat others says something about your faith. James says this so very well. You heard that earlier when Pastor Ray read that description of when a rich man or a rich person would come into your church and a poor person would come in to your faith gathering. How do you treat them? How do you think about them? What are your perceptions of them? I thought this was such a wonderful example that I thought I would illustrate this. I reached out to my good friend, Pastor Chris Franz, who's at Advent Lutheran Church in Westchester, and I said, could you help me out? Could you send over this morning someone who was kind of looked like they were a little bit richer and someone who looked like they were a little bit poorer? They're here this morning, and I would ask them if they would stand. I think they're here this morning. If you saw them, thank you very much for being here and helping us out this morning. If you saw them this morning, what was your thought? What was your reaction? How did you think about that in what James describes to us? I thank them for helping us to just check ourselves a little bit in that perception. I would also thank two of our members. They actually have two services over at Advent Lutheran. Pastor Franz liked the idea so much, he said, could you send me some folks? So I would thank Steve and Jamie Lacombe and Bill and Barb Van, who went over to visit Advent this morning to pretend to be a rich person and a poor person, just to kind of check our perceptions. How do we think about others when we interact with them? James makes that very, very clear, to think that through, and that's part of how we live out in real and practical ways our faith. 3 things. A 4th thing that will help us, I think, to live out what James is describing is to be very aware of being part of a faith community. Like our faith community, we're here to help each other along the way in our faith journey. We're here for accountability with each other. I remember thinking about this early on in my ministry. The first church that I served, about a year in, had what they called a pastor parish review. It was a chance to see, as the new pastor, how things were going. And at that gathering, my call committee chairman, his name was Roger, he reminded me that I needed to not only talk the talk, but to walk the walk, that I needed to be careful about my actions. Now, I thought about this for a while. Roger was somebody that I knew very well. We lived about 8 hours away from family, and Roger and his family sort of adopted us. All the minor holidays, 4th of July, Labor Day, Memorial Day, that kind of thing, they would invite us over to their house. We weren't going to travel all the way back to Pennsylvania from Ohio. So I was at Roger's house often, and I kept thinking about what he said. And you know, sometimes you have those questions, you kind of don't want to ask it, but you need to ask it. A couple weeks after that parish review, I was sitting in the living room alone with Roger, and I said, Roger, you made this comment. How am I doing? I needed to know. I needed to know whether he saw anything in my character, because I was often at his house, that wasn't consistent with my faith. I'm glad to report that Roger said, I don't see anything inconsistent in your character, but you just need to be aware of this. And he actually made reference to the pastor I mentioned before, who had been at that church where the actions and the words weren't consistent. The church, faith community, gives us the opportunity to be accountable to each other, to help us along the journey. And we also have the opportunity when we gather as a faith community. And I know, by the way, I'm preaching to the choir here. You're here this morning. You're part of the faith community. You're watching online. You're part of the faith community. But we have the opportunity to encourage each other. A great example of this was several weeks back when we collected food for the local food pantry for tax. In that encouragement of each other, we collected over 1,000 pounds of food. Now, it could have been that each of us would have woken up one morning and said, hey, I'm going to collect some food for the local food pantry. But the fact that we did that together, we kind of encouraged each other along the way to help out those in need. Or we have some current opportunities. There's already a pile of things that are being collected for Coatesville that was severely affected during Hurricane Ida. Hopefully you saw the emails that came out from the church, or the opportunity to help out Messiah Lutheran Church in Downingtown that was flooded because of Ida. Or there's a third opportunity through Lutheran Disaster Response to help out those in need. We gather as faith community to gather our resources and to do more to encourage each other to live out our faith. And then 1/5 thing, very, very practical, is just wake up every day and say to yourself, I'm going to try and live out my faith in one real way today. I'm going to make one phone call to somebody I know that maybe is a little down and I can cheer them up. I'm going to give one financial gift to a charity or somebody that I find in need that I interact with today. I'm going to say one kind word to somebody that I interact with throughout the day. I'm going to do one concrete gesture every day to live out our faith. Just one thing each day. I've been thinking about this since just the other day I heard about a man in my previous congregation who passed away. And this was a guy who lived this out. He's much beloved in that congregation and in that community because every day he tried to just live out one concrete, loving way of living out his faith. I was thinking about him the other day. I was laying in bed thinking and praying and giving thanks for his life. And I thought about this verse from James where he says it so clearly about living out our faith. And I realized James puts it in the negative and says, faith without works is dead. But you could also put it in the positive. And what a great way to think about faith. That faith with works is alive. It's alive. That's what we want, to have a faith alive. Amen.